Thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. But we appreciate you spending some time with Edge today for our webinar, Accessibility Priorities for 2025, Policy, Procurement, and Practice. Really excited to have a focus on this really essential topic for the higher ed community today. And before we get into the meat of today's session, I want to share just a couple quick slides for folks who may not be as familiar with Edge, just a little bit of information about us and why we're bringing people together on this topic today. So Edge is a nonprofit, member-based research and education network and a technology consortium. We were founded by the higher education community, by the New Jersey President's Council for Higher Education. And so we started in New Jersey, but the mission and the service area have really expanded throughout the region and indeed nationwide. That number should be 23 and might be 25 within the next couple weeks. We're continuing to expand and serve more and more institutions all across the country in a few different ways. So as I said, we really are focused on serving the higher education community, the public sector. And to do that, we know every institution is a little bit different. So we have a really sort of focused and customized approach that really helps institutions maximize the outcomes that they're looking to achieve. We know every institution's mission is a little bit different. Every institution's team and capabilities are a little bit different. And so we are very flexible in our approach to how we support the higher education community and individual institutions in the effective use of technology. We do that in a few different ways. I mentioned we're a research and education network. That's sort of the heritage of what we were founded to do. That's EdgeNet. So we have a purpose-built optical fiber network that runs around New Jersey and the surrounding region. We've got institutions from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York that take internet connectivity from Edge to get out to the cloud, to get out to educational tools, to get out to the various research platforms and high-performance computing needs that you might need, and help to collaborate across the country to do those sorts of things. We also operate from a procurement perspective as a cooperative pricing system. So just the same as any of the big national co-op contracts, we operate Edge Market, and we really take a focused approach to helping members solve technology challenges through our procurement arm to really accelerate the way institutions can onboard and roll out new technologies that are going to really move the needle for their communities. We do events, networking, and community building, like what we're doing here today in a webinar format. We also host conferences. We have 3 single-day conferences throughout the academic calendar each year. We have EdgeCon Autumn, our kickoff for the year, coming up on October 9th, which we're hosting at Rider University in New Jersey. And our Digital Teaching and Learning Focus Conference is in April 15th at the College of New Jersey this year. And we would love for as many of you folks to join us at that conference. Accessibility will certainly still be a big topic in April, and that'll certainly be a focus there. We also deliver thought leadership and solution development to our community in a few different areas. So broadly in the topic of digital transformation support, in cybersecurity, in digital teaching and learning, and in things like AI and cloud strategy. That has surfaced in a few different specific ways. We're really working with institutions to bring some depth and strategy to conversations around how to integrate AI across administrative applications, curriculum infrastructure, really anywhere that these new technologies are going to touch. We will help support institutions in sort of evaluating and strategizing investments in a year or 3-year strategic plan. GLBA and other cybersecurity compliance requirements are increasingly essential, especially as it relates to institutions making sure that they're handling data and from a privacy perspective effectively to continue receiving financial aid and things like that. And then application modernization and business process modeling is increasingly important as institutions look to leverage new LMSs or new ERPs that might be cloud-based or in different models, or new vendors that they haven't worked with before. We're really encouraging institutions to take a deep look at the ways that the processes in their functional offices and student support in the ways they roll out courses are ready to take best advantage of these new, modern, and very expensive platforms, so that as you're making an investment in a new solution, you know that your team is ready to take full advantage of that and maximize the return on investment you're going to make. And then, of course, on the digital learning side of things, ADA compliance is a growing challenge and a more urgent challenge for our higher education community these days. And that's where I will hand it off to the real meat of today's session. We're really, really lucky today to be joined by Dr. Laura Romeo. Laura is EDGE's Director of Digital Learning Innovation, Scholarship, and Educational Services, and has a real particular focus on helping institutions solve their accessibility challenges. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll invite Laura to share hers and get into the bulk of today's session. So Laura, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Just 1 minute while I switch over.
And while Laura's pulling her screen up, I'll encourage you again, please, as the session is rolling, take full advantage of the chat, take full advantage of the Q&A. We'll be monitoring those. We'll make sure to get to everybody's questions before we break today, and or follow up with you afterwards. So Laura, take it away.
All right, and just to do a double check, you can see my slides, right?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, and thank you to Adam for that introduction. So in my role at EDGE, I get to work with institutions of all sizes, from community colleges to big research universities, really just helping them strengthen their digital learning ecosystems. And a big part of that work is making sure accessibility isn't treated like an afterthought, but really built into the foundation of how we design, how we purchase, and how we deliver learning. This is also something that matters to me personally. My graduate and doctorate work focused on accessibility and inclusive teaching practices through Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. So at the heart of it, I believe that accessibility isn't just about compliance. It's about making sure all students can succeed. And honestly, that perspective shapes everything I do. And so at EDGE, we've partnered with campuses all across the country. And right now we're helping institutions get ready for the compliance deadlines coming up in 2026 and 2027. What we're really focused on is helping schools move beyond those one-time fixes into sustainable and student-centered practices. So today, I'll share what we're seeing, the places where institutions often get stuck, and what's happening right now, and then how you can start getting ready for what's ahead. So let's start with the big picture. Accessibility is more than just checking a box. At the end of the day, it's truly about equity and inclusion, about making sure every student has a fair chance to succeed. That really just means thinking about the wide range of student needs. So from students who are blind or have low vision, to those who are deaf or hard of hearing, to students with mobility challenges who rely on keyboards or other input devices. It also includes students with learning differences and students who are neurodiverse. Now, there's also the compliance side of this. Schools are expected to meet standards like Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that's WCAG 2.1, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. And if those schools fall short, it's not just their students who are affected. It can also open the door to legal issues and financial risk. Accessibility isn't all about compliance either. It really shapes how a school is seen. When campuses make accessibility a true priority, they tend to get recognized as leaders in innovation, inclusion, and student success. And so, from what we've seen in our work, the institutions that truly build accessibility into their digital learning practices aren't just protecting themselves legally, they're creating those stronger, more resilient learning environments that can support students now and also for the long term. So for those who may be newer to this or just need a quick refresher, WCAG 2.1, that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those are the international standards that most schools use to measure digital accessibility. Now, they were originally written for websites, and in practice, they actually apply across the whole digital ecosystem. So that means course materials, learning platforms, student portals, and even third-party tools that are integrated in. These guidelines are built around four principles: Perceivable means students can actually get to the information. So here, think alt text on images or captions on videos. Operable means that students can navigate it, whether that's with a mouse, a keyboard, or assistive technology. Understandable means information is clear and consistent, so students aren't confused by moving from one part of a course to another. And robust means that it works reliably across different devices, in different browsers, and with different technologies such as screen readers. So these four principles are pretty simple, and they give faculty and staff and campus leaders an easy way to see how accessibility connects to their own work. And it's not just IT, it's not just faculty. Everyone actually has a role, and everyone is accountable. And we'll get a little bit more into that later, but this kind of shared approach is what really helps institutions move forward. So, why are we talking about this now? And why is 2025 such an important year? The short answer to this is that the clock is ticking. Under new ADA Title II rule, public colleges and universities are required to meet WCAG 2.1 level AA by 2026 or 2027, depending on their size. This doesn't just apply to what gets created moving forward, it includes existing websites, course materials, mobile apps, and student-facing platforms. So if you're at a private institution, you may not fall under this exact deadline, but you're still covered by the ADA and Section 504. So the direction is still the same. Accessibility just truly isn't optional anymore. So this is really just a turning point. I think for most institutions, it's the moment when accessibility stops being treated as optional or reactive and becomes one of the ways that schools are judged on their resilience, on their innovation, and on how students are succeeding. So the campuses that wait until the last minute will probably spend more money, more time, and have less control over their process. So the ones that start now, and again, this is why this is important, they can move forward at their own pace and build in systems that last and then also demonstrate a good faith effort. So that's why 2025 is kind of the year to move from compliance to commitment. It's going to be putting those real systems in place now so that equity is built into everything you do moving forward. Before we go any further, I did just want to pause and make a clarification. So this session is meant to provide educational guidance and not legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. So when it comes to interpreting the law, institutions should always turn to their own counsel. That said, our work is shaped by the legal landscape. So we stay on top of federal guidance and accessibility requirements, and we're going to use that knowledge to help campuses build strategies that will reduce risk and strengthen student success. So right now, many of the institutions that we work with are focused on practical ways to get ahead of the compliance deadlines. And so that's, again, what today is about. Steps that you can take and that faculty, instructional designers, deans, senior leaders, we all can play a role in. So if you want to go deeper, there are actually some really great resources out there, and I'll share them at the end of the webinar so that you have them handy. But with that context in mind, let's go ahead and move into today's session, which are the 5 action items that should be at the top of every institution's accessibility agenda for 2025. Okay, so again, let's talk about these 5 action items. The first is self-evaluation. Institutions need to really understand where they stand across their courses, in their systems, and the services that they offer and provide. The second is procurement. Accessibility has to be built into purchasing. So your tools, platforms, services really need to be reviewed before they're adopted, not after. Third is policy, a written accessibility policy that actually gets implemented and enforced, not just one that's drafted, put on a shelf, and forgotten. Fourth is training and capacity building. Accessibility cannot be a one-time workshop. It has to be ongoing, it has to be practical, it has to be real world so that people can actually put it into practice. And the fifth is an accessibility statement with a clear way for students to report barriers. Students need to know how to get help, and institutions need to know how to respond. So the next several slides will walk through each of these action items, what they mean a little bit more in depth, why they matter, and how campuses are putting them into practice. I'll also share some examples from our work with institutions so that you can see how schools like yours are tackling challenges right now and preparing for the future. So let's start with the first, conducting a self-evaluation. Schools really need a clear picture of where they stand because you can't improve what you haven't measured. Self-evaluation gives just a snapshot. It shows how accessible your courses, platforms, and materials really are, and it's going to help uncover barriers before they turn into student complaints or move into legal action. By doing a self-assessment, it's going to create a roadmap. It will highlight where compliance gaps are and where changes will make the biggest difference for students. From what we're seeing in our work with campuses, self-evaluations are helping leaders prioritize their resources strategically. So instead of trying to fix everything all at once, you can focus on what matters the most. And that's really where improvements become realistic and then sustainable. So even with the best intentions, schools often hit roadblocks when they try to evaluate accessibility. Sometimes we see that the scope is too small. Maybe 3 or 4 courses get reviewed, and people just assume that it reflects the whole institution. Other times, a consultant delivers a long, detailed report, but without that follow up plan, like I mentioned, it just sits on a shelf. And often, sometimes ownership can get a little messy. So, is it IT, faculty, instructional designers, administration? Who's taking accountability for this? So without that clear responsibility put in place, evaluations tend to stall. Automated tools like Ally can help. They only, however, show part of the picture. So they're not going to catch those issues like navigation, course structure, or how usable a course actually feels for a student who might be using a screen reader or other assistive technology. So that's really why we found that the human side of audits is so important. And at Edge, we kind of blend these automated checks with a hands-on review so that evaluation really reflects the student experience. And again, the stakes are real. So if we see that this work is skipped up front, schools typically tend to pay for it later. So as an example, at one university in Texas, students using screen readers couldn't access their learning system. And that led to a federal complaint, and the school was required to complete a full evaluation across all courses and platforms on a compliance timeline that was not their own. So it was more expensive, really rushed, and far less effective than doing it right the first time around. And as a note, even though we do call this a self evaluation, you don't have to, and honestly, you really shouldn't go at it alone. This is kind of where Edge comes in. So we work alongside campuses to make evaluation part of a bigger strategy, not just that one time project that you check off of your list of things to do. So when evaluation is woven into that ongoing work that you do, it's going to set the stage for everything else, from procurement decisions to accessibility policies, training priorities, and even how barriers get reported and addressed. Action item 2, procurement. This is one of those areas that often gets overlooked, but it's actually going to be one of the most important. So every time a campus brings in a new tool or a new platform, a new service, it really starts to shape the whole digital environment that students are working in. And accessibility, if it's not a part of that decision, then you're already kind of starting behind the line. What we've seen is that a lot of schools buying a tool they'll do it, they'll buy the tool first, and then they'll realize later that it doesn't work for all students. And so at that point, you're stuck trying to retrofit. And retrofitting, if you've ever done it, it's expensive, it's slow, and it doesn't always typically tend to fix the problem. So that's why building in accessibility into procurement upfront makes such a difference. It's going to save time, it saves money, and then it also signals to students and regulators that accessibility matters to you. More and more federal enforcement is looking specifically at whether schools are including accessibility into their purchasing processes. So definitely something that is an action item to keep in mind. And like I said, this is an overlooked area, so it tends to be an area where we see a lot of schools struggle. Sometimes contracts get signed with no accessibility review at all, and by the time issues show up, the campus is locked into a system that doesn't work for all students. Other times, often procurement is left to individual departments, and then there's no consistency across campus. And again, you're finding that there are um, problems that you're trying to retroactively fix. And the result with all of this is that it causes frustration for everyone. Faculty are expected to teach with tools that don't work. Students are left asking for one-off accommodations, and leadership is then stuck again funding these retrofits or even finding a replacement for the entire system. And the risks aren't theoretical. Another example in Los Angeles, a large community college district faced a lawsuit after adopting software and course materials that weren't accessible. So the resolution made it clear that procurement has to include accessibility reviews before you adopt it, or again, you might take on that legal and financial risk. And from our work at Edge, we've seen procurement become probably one of the strongest levers for change. We've helped campuses build checklists and align purchasing with best practice so that the process becomes a lot more clear, more consistent, and again, sustainable. So you can kind of take it out into the long term. And when that happens, procurement shifts from sometimes being a headache to becoming a safeguard, saving that time, reducing your cost, and also, and most importantly, sending a clear message that inclusion isn't optional. Oh, we skipped one. Hang on, let's go back. And now nothing's working. Okay, action item number 3. Accessibility policies are more than just paperwork. They're what bring consistency. So here we think about having a written policy that really sets the expectations for faculty, staff, vendors, and it just really makes sure that accessibility isn't just out there and left up to chance. These written policies really show your students. They also show the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, and the public that accessibility is a real expectation. And so, again, let's kind of think about why is 2025 different? These agencies are paying a lot more attention to what they call a good faith effort. That doesn't mean that you've fixed every barrier yet, but it does mean that you can point to the real actions that you're taking. So adopting a policy, communicating it clearly, enforcing it across your campus, that's what is going to demonstrate progress. And again, a policy that just kind of sits on the website without any follow through doesn't really carry any weight. And so that's why implementation matters just as much as adoption. So a strong policy really only makes an impact if it's active, enforced, and part of everyday practice. All right, so let's be honest. The hard part isn't usually writing the policy, it's making sure that it lives beyond the paper. Too often, as I mentioned, policies get drafted. They might even get posted online, but then they never get adopted. They never get put into practice. Or possibly, maybe they are adopted, but nobody really communicates them. So faculty and staff might not even realize that they exist, and then that daily practice doesn't change. Another big issue that we see is accountability. If there's no clear enforcement, the policy stops having any real effect. So, federal agencies have actually called schools out for this. Policies that exist on paper, but don't show any evidence of real follow through. There's no action behind them. So, in other words, the school could point to a policy and say, here, we've got one again, but no action to show for it. Ownership is another sticking point. Sometimes it's hard for somebody to step up and claim responsibility, or you might find that campus politics slow things down. So that's where having a third party that can step in can really help. So when Edge works with campuses, we are able to bring in those best practices and also act as a neutral voice that is able to clear roadblocks, navigate through challenges, and help leaders get on the same page. Okay, moving on to action item 4, accessibility is not something that you can just cover with a single workshop and then check it off your list. It takes ongoing learning so that your faculty, staff, and administrators all know their role, know who's accountable for what, and they also learn the skills to be able to put it into practice. So the one reason why this does have to be ongoing is because things keep changing. Technology has changed, laws evolve. So what used to work and might have worked 5 years ago might not meet today's standards. So training is how institutions stay current and ready to respond while also being proactive. So capacity building is also a big part of this. When campuses invest in building their own expertise, they can handle more of the day-to-day issues with confidence. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to do it all on their own, though. What we're seeing is what works best is a mix. So, internal training for the everyday needs paired with that outside support when the challenges get a little bigger. And that balance is really what makes accessibility sustainable for the long term. And here's the big takeaway and a real takeaway. So, consistent training keeps schools proactive, not reactive. So, instead of scrambling at the last minute to meet compliance or to fix an issue or to address a concern, you're really working with that training to build a culture where accessibility just becomes part of everyday practice. The mind shift happens, and it's what people automatically start to do. When it comes to training, we do see some familiar patterns that kind of hold schools back. One of the biggest is when, again, it happens once and then it just disappears. So a single session might raise awareness and it might meet the goal of teaching people about what the need is. But without that reinforcement, the knowledge just kind of fades away and then practice doesn't change. Another challenge is making training useful. If it's too technical, people tend to tune out. If it's too abstract, they might leave the training thinking, okay, but what do I actually do? How do I take this and put it into my work? So, leadership support plays a big role here. If it's not modeled or encouraged from the top down, you'll see participation drop off and then training just gets treated like another box to check. And then again, accountability, you hear that a lot, but there is also accountability for this. So it's not enough to say that we offer training. Schools really need to be able to show to an auditor, for example, that everyone has gone through a baseline training. But more importantly, they need to show that people are actually putting into practice what they learned. And so that's why it becomes best and it works best when it's paired with that practice. So sometimes you might see that occur in a live session. Not all the time does that work. So sometimes training can become asynchronous. However, the key here is follow through. So helping faculty and staff apply it into their daily work, providing that support. So that's when training stops being an event and starts becoming part of your school culture. Okay, so the fifth action item is publishing an accessibility statement and creating a barrier reporting process. So this is actually different from the written policy that we talked about earlier. The policy is internal. It's kind of the rule book that guides faculty, staff, and vendors, and it makes sure accountability is part of the institution's culture. The statement is going to be outward facing. It's designed for students and the public. So this statement should be clear, short, practical. It tells students, here is our commitment to accessibility. Here is where you can go for help. And here's how you can report a barrier, because that's going to be the reality. Accessibility issues will happen even if you are the most prepared campus. The question isn't really whether barriers exist, it's how students can report them and also how quickly the institution responds. So the statement and reporting process becomes kind of like a feedback loop. The policy sets the standard, but the statement really shows how it works in practice. So together, they build confidence for students who really just need to know that they'll be heard, and for faculty and staff who need those clear processes and support, and then also for agencies who are looking for that evidence of progress. This is another area where good institutions can fall short. Sometimes schools do have an accessibility statement, but maybe it's buried 2 or 3 or 4 clicks deep in a website. So if students can't find it, it's probably not doing its job. Other times, maybe the wording is so vague or written in legalese that students have no idea what it actually means for them. So if they can't read it or understand how it's going to help them, then the message just becomes lost. Another barrier is unclear instructions. So if it's not obvious how to report an issue or who's going to respond to that issue, most students won't even use it, and then the issue becomes lost or elevated. And finally, follow through is really critical here. So we've seen campuses collect reports, but then nothing happens. They sit there. There's no updates. There's no visible action. So when that happens, again, students tend to lose trust, and regulators notice that as well. So some of this might sound really basic. Make the statement easy to find, write it in plain language, actually respond when a student reports a problem. But the truth is that even the basics aren't always happening. And that's why we're here, to call out these gaps, to talk about the challenges, and to really open up the conversation about how schools can start closing them. So before we move on, just want to zoom out for a minute and look at the big picture. Here are the 5 accessibility priorities that we've covered so far today: self-evaluation, accessible procurement, a written policy, training and capacity building, and a clear accessibility statement with reporting process. So these are the 5 action items that every institution should be focusing on right now in 2025. Each one does matter on its own, but together you'll find that they kind of create a roadmap, a way to make real progress before those 2026 and 2027 deadlines hit. So I think if you could think of this as kind of like your checklist for the year ahead, that would be a good place to start. And if your campus is moving forward in each of these 5 areas, then you're really going to find yourself in a strong position. So as we look ahead, the accessibility landscape is shifting pretty quickly. On the standard side, WCAG 2.2 is already published, and WCAG 3.0 is on the way. It's in development. So the bar here for compliance is just continuing to move forward. We're also seeing a lot of new challenges with AI. I know that's been the buzz conversation in many of my meetings. So just like the accessibility standards keep evolving, AI is changing the landscape too. So you'll see tools that grade, tutor, or even create content are kind of seeping into everything now. But they really truly raise big accessibility questions. So is AI generated content screen reader friendly? Do automated graders recognize different ways of showing knowledge? Can tutoring bots kind of adapt to diverse learners, or do they just continue to reinforce bias? So here's the catch. Auditors and regulators are also starting to ask about this too. As I said, it's a big topic coming up, and it's really changing the way that we are thinking and doing. So addressing AI's accessibility impact is not going to be optional. It should be part of what's becoming the main conversation, so that when outside scrutiny comes in, you have an answer and a response. And then again, there's accountability more broadly. So more states are auditing accessibility directly, which means that the outside scrutiny could come sooner than expected. Institutions may be asked to show a plan or document training, demonstrate how they're responding to those reported barriers. And if the processes aren't in place, you might find yourself scrambling, and that scramble costs more, it looks worse, and it really breaks down trust between your faculty and staff, between your students, and between your community. So campuses that can already point to their policies, their evaluations, the reporting systems are going to find themselves in a much stronger position when the audits do happen. So bringing it back around, why does this matter right now? The steps that you can take right now in 2025 are not going to just be about compliance. They are going to directly shape the student experience and determine how ready you'll be for those deadlines in 2026, 2027. A self-evaluation this year can really guide your next budget cycle. Procurement reviews this year could keep you from being locked into inaccessible systems for the next 5 years. Training this year means your faculty are already going to be equipped with the new rules that are already taking effect and looking out into the future. So, in short, acting now just is really going to put you ahead of the curve. It's going to save you money, reduce risks, build credibility, and probably most importantly, make digital learning better for your students. That's always been my biggest goal whenever I am approaching content development, is the student experience. So as we wrap up, I just want to leave you with a few takeaways. Accessibility in 2025 is not just about checking a compliance box. I don't think I could say that enough. It is about making sure students succeed. So the 5 action items that we talked through today will give you a clear path forward. And starting now matters. As I've been saying, it lowers your risk, it saves you money, and most importantly, it makes sure students don't have to wait for change. When you make things more accessible for students with disabilities, you actually improve clarity and usability for everyone. So it's a win-win. The work that you do this year will also set you up for what's coming next, the new standards, new technologies like AI, and also higher expectations across the board. So again, if there's kind of one message that I hope you take back, it's this: accessibility is an investment. Yes, of course, it does help with compliance. It helps with those deadlines coming, but it's going to drive that student success. It's going to spark innovation across your learning community, and it's going to build into your future. So the nice thing is you don't have to take on this alone. This is where Edge can really help. So we don't just talk about these 5 action items. We will partner with campuses to put them into practice. So when it comes to self-evaluation, we run accessibility audits and system reviews that give you a clear picture of where barriers are and a roadmap of where to focus first. That way, the work doesn't just stop with a report, it provides priority for driving that action. With procurement, we make sure accessibility is part of the vendor conversation from the very beginning. That includes reviewing vendor documentation, helping with RFP language, building accessibility checks into purchasing. So again, you don't get stuck with systems, platforms, tools that create barriers and create problems later down the road. On the policy side, we support drafting and aligning accessibility policies so expectations are clear across your entire institution. And we also help with communication. So those policies don't just live on a website, but they actually will shape your practice and make the change that you're looking for. For training, we deliver workshops for faculty, staff, and leadership that are going to be practical, they're going to be repeatable, and they're really just designed to build that long-term capacity. So again, the goal isn't just a one-time event, it's going to be creating the knowledge and the habits to make accessibility part of your culture. And then with barrier reporting, we help campuses connect the accessibility statement to a real process. That just means setting up forms and workflows that are going to be simple for students to use, transparent for administrators, and that will close the loop with accountability. So the big takeaway here, Edge helps you move from having a checklist on paper to making measurable progress across your entire digital ecosystem. So yes, making sure that you meet compliance for these deadlines coming up, but also really build into long-term success for your students and your faculty and your staff and your institution as a whole. Okay, so before we move into Q&A, I know that I mentioned the resources that are great. So I wanted to share a few here. I'll drop all the links into the chat so that you don't have to track them down. Real quick, the Office for Civil Rights has guidance on accessibility requirements and how complaints are handled. The ADA National Network is great for plain language explainers so that you can share with colleagues. The W3C Web Accessibility Initiative is the home for WCAG standards. This website's a bit dense, but definitely the go-to source. And AHEAD, the Association on Higher Education and Disability, is really an excellent resource for connecting legal, policy, and classroom practice in higher ed. And of course, EDGE is here as a partner. Our role is to help institutions put these ideas into practice and really keep your momentum going. All right, so now I'd love to hear from you.
All
Where do you see your institution already making progress with accessibility? Where do you see opportunities to grow? And of course, this is also the time to ask any questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. This is just a chance for us to connect what we've learned today directly to your campus context.
And we've got a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A, so we can jump right in there. And thank you, Laura, for a really excellent session so far. Questions. Let's start with this one. What is the ideal organizational structure that can sustain accessibility in culture and practice? We have an Office of Accessibility under the Student Success Center that handles accommodation requests. How would a different structure be conceived, or should a different structure be conceived? And what do you see when you work with other institutions?
Okay, so just so I'm making sure I'm in the right spot, because I also do like to read when I'm thinking
Yeah.
about these things. So this is going to be in our Q&A, right?
Yes, this is the question that came in at 1:38. I'm going to turn
Perfect.
around a little bit.
If I can find it. Everything gets all jumbled up. Okay, so I think my biggest takeaway with this question is not necessarily redesigning departments, but more just making sure that all your offices and all of your departments across your institution are communicating together, are getting the same message, are coming up with, the same standard policy and procedures, so that everybody kind of understands what each individual office department person is responsible for, so that that doesn't get left up to question, or get dropped down and nobody kind of picks up the problem. um, I feel like I left some of the information that I wanted to share out of that, but maybe we'll cycle back around.
Yeah, and I think we'll touch on some of the structure stuff as we go through the rest of the questions, and some of that is unique to the culture and structure of each institution as well. So I think to jump around a little bit, we had a couple questions sort of related to interacting accessibility with faculty at the institutions, and so we'll go next to Laura here. Scott's question. Short of requiring faculty to make accessibility built into their courses and a part of the culture, how do institutions handle the significant workload added to faculty plates, at least in the near future? We're an AAUP, a union faculty institution, and suspect that this will be a bargaining issue around workload.
Yeah, so I think that that's probably a huge challenge, right? Is to one, get faculty to buy into it, and then two, navigate through the time constraints. I'm just thinking through all of the retroactive fixes that are now happening. So, what are your issues in each individual course that are getting flagged, that are needing that human touch for accessibility? And then moving into changing the mindset so that it is more of a proactive practice. So we're not continuing this like cycle of fix, fix, fix because the problem keeps coming back. So I think asking faculty and staff to sit in on more workshops, more professional development, more training does sometimes come across as a big ask. Where's the time? When am I going to do this? I have all of these other responsibilities. However, if you can put the big why in, so yes, it's about making sure that you're not going to get slapped with a lawsuit, but it's really ensuring that every single student that enrolls in your course can get the most out of what you're trying to teach them, because they can have access, because they can interact with your materials, because they can engage with their peers. So I think kind of turning it over into student-centered, person-centered approach that sometimes tends to buy in a little bit more people. And also, putting it back and providing voice to those that it actually affects. Letting the students speak up and say why it matters that, there are all these barriers, what they can't approach with the content or course, or what works really well for them. So, kind of maybe giving voice to your students on campus, or even to faculty that are also working with screen readers, or working to, break up their cognitive load. I think that having a real world experience perspective in front of you sometimes is the biggest helper for that buy-in.
I'll I'll also brag on Laura's team a little bit here in the sense that in those institutions where that time, that bandwidth for the faculty to actually get to do that hands-on work isn't always there. That's part of the work that we do in instructional support as an organization, is sort of take on some of that nitty gritty behind the scenes work and course updates and accessibility updates on behalf of and partner with the faculty to do that effectively, sort of at scale. So that's the other side of the support that we can provide, is if that's a sticking point with faculty and it's not something we're able to get them on board with, Edge is able to kind of do some of that dirty work in the background to streamline that workflow as well. And we do have a couple suggestions came in through the chat. Chad mentions that he's explained it as an adopted workflow, similar to spell checking an item prior to releasing it, check for accessibility as well on the way out, which I think is a good best practice to share. And then Eric shared that There's a strategy to hire instructional designers to create peer-developed courses, what they call PDCs, or a master course that can be distributed to individual faculty. From there, they can make content changes based on their individual course, but they've at least got that shell that's designed for accessibility. And I think that's something we've seen be a good strategy as well, right, Laura?
100%. Yeah, I like that idea.
Yeah. So thank you for those.
And we, yep. Oh,
Keep them coming as we go too. Um, just real quick to add on to the faculty conversation, there was a comment here that what advice would you give to faculty who think that because they're a private institution, the government mandate may not fully apply? Is that the case in your understanding, or do private institutions need to do all the same things a public would?
So private institutions are not being held accountable for the WCAG standards right now with their 2026, 2027 deadlines. However, I mean, again, like accessibility is not just a legal box. And for those faculty, wish they were on this webinar so then we could speak directly to them. However, accessibility is really, I mean, maybe you could take the message back that it's completely 100% tied to student success. It's tied to retention. It's tied to reputation for the school. So private institutions, in my experience, typically market themselves for personalized learning, for excellence in the field. And so, if you have an accessible course or content, or somebody who is kind of pushing back on these best practices, it really is going to start to undermine that promise of excellence. And it can, I mean, any student anywhere, whether they're in a public institution or a private institution, can file a complaint. So, even though the standards and regulations are not set in place for privates, they can still, have legal action brought on them. So I guess if we're going that direction as compliance, it still matters. So, pressure is still high.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a comment here that's Sherry has the understanding that private institutions that accept federal funding from HHS actually are required to meet Section 504. So maybe it depends on some of the funding sources and some of that stuff as well. And Chad also reinforces again that, and I think right along the lines of what you were saying, private institutions can read the research out there regarding how accessibility can affect ROI and increase exposure for the institution and reputation. So I think, I'll try to pull in the same direction on that one. We have a couple questions related to accessibility and procurement and third-party integration here. So we can jump to there. Looks like they came in around 144 and 145 on your panel there, Laura. So first, what strategies can procurement use to balance accessibility compliant with curricular needs when vendors do not provide accessible academic tools and alternate resources, similar tools are limited?
I'm thinking.
Yeah.
That was a big one.
Yeah.
And I don't have my panel, so I can't see it and read it. So I don't know if you could drop that into the chat. I have the chat. That one didn't disappear.
I will. I'll drop that. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm fully, that was a more in-depth question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good one because they're, if it's
100%.
if it's a specialized solution, and there's only one vendor that does it, and they've decided they're not taking the time to make their tool accessible, do we just have to bite the bullet, or how do we approach that?
Yeah. So I think that okay, so I'm going to go backwards. If alternative resources are limited, if they're scarce, then procurement's role should be to document, to negotiate, and then ideally to mitigate risk while also supporting that academic need? Now I understand. I understand that's the question. So how do we do that, right? So I think that one is to document the gap. Okay, so if you then go and require the vendor to provide current VPAT or WCAG conformance report, and then if that gap does exist on their side, then document them in the procurement record along with the academic justification for its use. So I think my overarching answer that I'm coming up with is that transparency here is the biggest factor that you're going to want to work into, balancing that compliance with the need. So showing communication between the campus, between the instructor, if that's possible, to explain the need, the why, to the, third party vendor, then again, I think the documentation portion is going to be probably key for that. And ideally, the vendor will say, "Oh, you're right. This is really important," and then go fix their issue for the remediation portion on their side. Um,
And if they hear from
yeah,
enough institutions that this is a requirement, hopefully take that action on their end. And in the meantime, it's about documentation and justification, I guess. So here's the challenge we needed to solve. Here's why this tool was the only way to go. We tried to push for accessibility and they just can't do it right now, but we need the thing. And so this is why.
yeah, and yes, and so and I think if your brain in asking this question is geared toward, well, how am I supposed to make sure that everything is in compliance by the time the deadline comes? Again, if you have the documentation in place, that there are these conversations that you have brought up this flagged issue, and it's either stalled because the vendor stalled it or what, like you should ideally be protecting yourself because you've done the work. You have the documentation to say you've communicated. And again, I know it's hard to retroactively talk about this, but in thinking about the webinar and the action items, when you are in procurement process, that's why it's so important to have those upfront conversations about accessibility with your potential vendor, so that you can say, like, I am aware that these are the things that I need to have in place for this particular tool or platform. What are you doing to make sure that that's in practice? So
Okay.
yeah.
We are at the posted time here. We have a few more minutes on the edge end, so we want to take and answer as many of these questions as we can. If you can stick with us, we would really appreciate it. Obviously, if you got to go, we understand that too. We'll have the rest. We'll have the whole session recorded, so you'll be able to refer back to these afterwards if you would like. So we're going to keep going with the questions. Feel free to join us, and if you got to run, we definitely understand. So next up here, we have, and I'll put this in the chat as well so that everyone can see it. But when you talk about writing a policy, do you mean a policy stating that faculty must ensure that all courses are accessible, images have alt text, videos have captions, etc.? Or what exactly do you mean by an institutional accessibility policy?
Yeah, so I think policy should be viewed as bigger than a checklist for faculty. It should be kind of like the institution-wide statement of your commitment and responsibility for accessibility. So typically you will see in a strong policy the scope, which is going to be, what are we talking about? What is going to be accessible? So which digital environments are included? Thank you, Chad, for the resource on that one. So you're thinking about, your LMS, your websites, any courseware, third-party tools. So kind of overall digital environment of accessibility. You'll also have standards listed in your policy. So what are the benchmarks that your institution is aligning to, whether it's, WCAG 2.1 AA, section 508, what standards are you specifically addressing? And then we get down to the roles and responsibilities, because again, accountability is very important. So who's responsible for what? I think then looking through your processes, so who's responsible, how's it going to be done, what's the action plan, and then of course the cyclical continuous improvement cycle, how's it monitored, what is the evaluation, what are the reviews, how can we continue to make it better. um yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So, and you mentioned right at the beginning that it's important that it's not just a checklist for faculty. But we did get a question that actually asked, do you have a checklist for first-time faculty? So I think maybe we approach this not as a checklist, but are there things as you're working with first-time faculty, a little bit greener faculty, that you would recommend they keep in mind if the institution maybe doesn't have a strong policy around accessibility or strong sort of guardrails for them? What should the faculty group be keeping it, sort of top of mind, if there are a few highlight items that you would call out?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, let me take it back a step. Yes, there is a checklist. However, you have to consider that the checklist should then be kind of modified to the institution based on, mission, values, scope of content that is covered in, coursework. That feels too specific. Let me walk it back. Okay, I've got a bunch of ideas going around in my head right now. So um so I think main takeaway for this particular question is, I kind of want to add to the point that it doesn't necessarily need to be a checklist for new faculty, but faculty across the board, even if they're established, even if they're adjunct, even if it's a student teacher, because they all have the access to touch content, to work with students. And so therefore, whoever, again, it comes back to accountability. Whoever is responsible for the ecosystem of learning really should kind of go through and think about best practice. Have I checked all my content, to make sure that students, no matter what their disability, can access it, not only access it, but get the meat of it. And so I think I'm going to stop there with that one. But I do think that yes, there are resources. Yes, we can provide them. And I think that it should span a little bit bigger than just somebody new to this.
Yeah. Yep. Understood. So this one is again going to touch on sort of the organizational structure and support side of things, and I'll put it in the chat, and then read it again as well. Our academic side of the house is providing tons of training and support, but there's no one on the finance and admin side of the house backing it up. The academic side has taken pity on the staff side and is including them only in things that might apply directly to their jobs. How do we encourage someone in institutional leadership on the finance and admin side to step up their support for staff, and I guess for faculty in the academic side, in supporting accessibility at the institution broadly? And maybe this is from just setting a tone at the institution and a culture. Maybe it's from a funding perspective. Do you have any sort of ideas or points of strategy on engaging more of the administration and understanding why this is important?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this just might be a breakdown in communication. Possibly, I'm seeing, our departments working in silos. There's not much shared speech going on. So I think that step one here would be to go to, so for the academic side, to speak with the finance and admin and say, here are the things that we are doing. This is why. This is what they've improved. And how can we would love your involvement. And maybe instead of asking them how they can get involved, go to them with a few action items and say, like, these are the top 3 areas that, we find we would really be able to use your support. And so that way, it doesn't just get left to them to one decide, because I think sometimes the issue ends up being areas in an institution, people don't know what they don't know. And so, if that lack of knowledge is not there, you don't want to just let it go and say, well, somebody else will take it over. So if you're seeing a lot of support on one side of the institution, we need to bring the other side over. So again, maybe like bring some case scenarios and say, like, this is where we've seen improvement, this is what we've done to get to that improvement, this is why it matters. And again, I hate to hang my hat on compliance, but sometimes people really need to hear, like, this could be a lawsuit. Other colleges are experiencing this right now. And so kind of, drive it home with a little bit of a heavier hit, to then bring it back and say, okay, well, now how can we support our students in this? Yeah.
Yeah, and in the chat, a point being made that a lot of the focus on this stuff tends to be on the academic side, but staff members
Mhm.
in some of these other offices are also creating documents and content that are sent out to students and need to be accessible as well. So that they really need to be involved in training and in this engagement on making sure documentation and things are accessible, because that's part of this too. And I think it's a great point that there is a ton of focus on the academic side, because that's really sort of the driving heart of the academic mission, and accessibility is sort of drawn that way. But yeah, makes a big impact, and needs to be a part of the strategy. In the functional office side, anybody that's creating documentation, students are going to work with as well.
Yeah, and I don't, sorry, I didn't want to
Yeah,
cut you
no,
off. I think that that's where creating that policy is going to be so important, because it's just going to designate across your entire institutions, every single department, what they are responsible for to make sure, you know, things are accessible, in your ecosystem. So having that and then disseminating it and then teaching on it, everything builds.
yeah. Um, Another question here, and we have it looks like 5 left, so we'll try and keep moving through them. Do you have any advice on how to deal or how to decide what videos need audio descriptions? Educational content is tricky. Do voiceover PowerPoints with lots of graphics need audio descriptions, for instance, or is a transcript as an alternative sufficient? The regulations and guidance I've seen around this haven't been detailed enough. And so looking for some additional input there.
Yeah, so this is a question that a variation of a question that I get very often. So let me answer my variation first, and then I'll come back to this. When courses have, for instance, YouTube videos embedded in their content, is it enough that the auto-generated captions, will that meet, accessibility compliance? And the short answer is no. So auto-generated typically doesn't capture, it's just capturing what is being spoken. But it might be that, an instructor is pointing to something behind him, and that caption doesn't pull the, mathematical equation. And so captions are really for students who are deaf or hard of hearing versus, the additional alternative of a transcript that will pull everything that is happening in the video, that will help someone who is blind or hard of seeing. So let me go back to this. Yes, educational content is tricky. I agree. There are a lot of different nuances to this. And I think you have to consider what tool do I need to put as the lens on whatever the content is. And then times it by all the tools, times it by all the, different disabilities that we need to be considering. Anyway, that's another conversation for another time. I know we're running out of time.
Well,
So
and
do
just to say, in addition to that, Edge is also right now under. I had mentioned Edge Market earlier, our procurement arm. Under our procurement arm, we're running an RFP for AI-enabled audio description and closed captioning platform. The point of that and the reason for AI enabled, and there's a service level agreement that guarantees a certain level of accuracy that we're looking for. But the trickiest part, or maybe not the trickiest part, but the complicating factor with going for services that do these things in the past has always been the cost, right? The $20 per minute or more that we hear about sometimes with some of these complex files that need audio, complex videos that need audio descriptions. We're looking for a platform that makes that much more affordable, and we're also looking to use our power as a consortium to make a joint investment on behalf of a group of institutions. So we would centralize a buy for a bucket of minutes for these audio description and closed captioning services and drive that cost down even further by doing that sort of aggregate buying motion as a consortium. So if that's something your institution might be interested in getting involved in, we're sort of in the home stretch on that procurement at this point. So we're going to be starting to look for partner institutions to be part of that first group from an investment perspective on some of those tools as well.
Yeah, and just to cycle back around to this, because I don't think I answered this specific question. I know I gave you the example of the YouTube. However, coming back to this, yes, audio descriptions are going to be fine as long as the narration fully describes whatever the visual is. So if there's a lot of graphic, they need to be described. If it's described in the transcript, it should be okay. I think the bottom line here is that, consider the student. Could students, regardless of maybe what challenge they have to access the content, are they going to be able to see, hear, view, think about that?
Yeah. So yeah, great point. And I wanted to share a comment that we had come in just to the hosts and panelists from Sonali, that they at their institution they have a student worker do visual interpreting to make visual content on videos accessible, and that sometimes humans are a little more powerful than technology. So if you have
100%, yes.
so if you have
Yes.
resources like that, that's a great great way to go. So kudos there. A few more questions here, and we'll go with a library side of things that I think is interesting. And let me put this in the chat for you as well. This one asks, how does Edge help institutions with library materials and accessibility? There are library groups working on this, but sometimes we're beholden to third-party vendors and publishers, and they're not nearly all accessible. On the other hand, we can't cut, for instance, Oxford University Press ebooks because they're not accessible and still provide the research and learning services that faculty and students need. So what would we sort of recommend, I guess, in that? And that's similar to the procurement and tools question earlier.
Exactly. Yeah, so it kind of does come down to procurement leverage. And I will say this, libraries are probably one of the hardest hit areas because they do rely so heavily on those third-party publishers, where institutions just don't have that much leverage. So I mean, this specific thing, how does Edge help? So we help by negotiating at scale with publishers, database providers. So with this, we can go directly to them, have those conversations, work on embedding accessibility requirements into the contracts and RFPs that you put out. So again, that just kind of helps your institution really push for higher standards collectively. Not just for you, honestly, but for multiple campuses at a time, because, for instance, Oxford University Press services many, right? So if, we can go and push for the higher standard and say, this is what needs to be changed. It's not only going to affect you and your institution, your students, but everybody that uses it. I think too, thinking about those barrier reports, having that process in place. So when a student can't access a resource, there is a very clear documented path, one, for them to report it, because if you don't know it's an issue, how are you going to help fix it? And two, for some sort of alternative access, whether it's, a different copy through maybe interlibrary loan, or possibly a disability service office somewhere, might have a different version of it. So yeah, and I'm sure if we sat down and thought about it and looked at, specific examples, we could really kind of hash out some
Yeah.
other type of management plan. But
All right, so we have one that I was hoping to use as the button for the session as we came down to full time with everybody here, but we had so many good questions that we're only getting to it now. But we'll make sure to distribute this to everybody anyway. But we have a question here, and I'll put this in the chat again. But this question asks, I have been told that a good faith effort is no longer enough. Compliance is the only option. I know there has to be a gray area here. I can't imagine an institution getting into huge trouble if one document in one course is not compliant, for instance. But where's the line?
yes. Okay. So I have thoughts on this. Let me put them together real quick. I Again, let me preface my before I give you my thoughts. I am not a lawyer. This is not from the legal standpoint. However, my knowledge and work is based on standards and regulations. So I think that there is a gray area. Enforcement cannot hinge on perfection, because that is not a thing. I think that enforcement hinges on the pattern of things. So should there be legal action? First of all, let me say compliance is the only option. Um, yes, we should be working toward making sure institutions are meeting those WCAG 2.1 standards. And honestly, and I didn't even mention it in our webinar, hopefully everybody makes it to this far to hear this, but in what is coming, the WCAG 2.2 and eventually 3.0, anytime you are working ahead, whatever work you do, so say that you are making sure you are meeting compliance for 2.2, even though that is not what is technically due next year or the year after, you're going to be pulling in everything that is already as baseline. If you'll be doing extra work, but securing yourself for the future is more of what I want to say. However, let's get back to this question. So if legal action happens, the court is going to look for whether or not an institution has a policy in place, has the standards very clearly outlined so that they know that you know what you are being compliant in. So again, this is where WCAG 2.1 AA is going to be in place. They will look for a process of implementation, Are you training your faculty and staff? Are you reviewing your courses? Are you working to embed accessibility in your procurement? So again, these 5 action items, if you are doing these action items, that to me, yes, shows the good faith effort, but it's also moving you forward. It's not just gonna, again, check off the box that you're doing what you can do, but it's actually gonna make progress and change happen. Um, so, I guess to continue, the barrier reporting, they will see that, should students have issues, which again, they will, you can't catch everything all at once, and there's always going to be something to fix because that's just how technology and digital learning is. However, if there is a place for students to request an issue when they encounter, either the fix, the alternative, something. And then again, just the documentation process of everything. So are you showing that remediation is an effort, is at the forefront of, the priority of the institution? What barriers have been identified? How are they being addressed? I think coming back around, I guess my final thought is compliance is the goal. Um, Good faith is the expectation. And so the action items that fall under leading toward compliance should not result in an institution being in trouble.
Yeah, you're not gonna have 100%, but if you have the pathways for students to raise issues, or the things built in, the processes and policies and things built in that are going to help you get closer and closer to 100%, that's the really important part. So that totally makes sense. We have a couple more questions that are sort of more tangentially related to the topic from today, so we'll get to those maybe and check them off quickly. We had a couple hands raised from Carla and Catherine. I just noted. If you do have additional questions, Ask Q&A is still open, so please drop them in there. We'll still be able to take a look at them. But we have a couple tangentially related things, like I said. One being, does accessibility also include ADA equipment like restrooms, doors, parking, etc.? For as far as ADA and OCR goes, those things are all very important. I think not really what we're touching on necessarily in this digital learning area, but as much as even digital wayfinding and any digital assets that your institution is going to have to find and get access to that stuff. That's all part of the mix, and looking at your institution's digital footprint. So that stuff definitely should be on the radar somewhere along the line. Anything to add there? I think that's pretty straightforward, right?
Yes.
Okay. Additionally, and this sort of gets down to maybe some individual student accommodations and things, but is there an extended time and/or break necessary to have for tests and assessments?
Um, I mean, I think that comes down to the student's personal accommodation. And honestly, I mean, put yourself in the student, not with the disability, but just a student that's sitting in your seat's position. Is it going to be stressful to them to be quizzed on 10 items and have to do it in 10 minutes? I mean, so I guess again, student forward thinking.
Yeah,
It might not necessarily be an accommodation, but what might just feel like best practice as far as assessments go.
sure. And then last one, and this is sort of a crossover within Edge, but with so many new technologies emerging, how can we balance providing students with meaningful technology support while also safeguarding their information and the institution's intellectual property when third-party platforms may not be, for instance, FERPA compliant? And so that certainly is, I think, a consideration when you're going through the procurement process on new tools. Those privacy compliance regulations should all be part of that. I think in your instructional technology team rolling out those tools should certainly be aware of any of those challenges. But that's also where you're starting to cross over into the IT support side and cybersecurity support and looking at who has access to what data, and what are sort of the data privacy policies and some of the other policies that your institution might have in place to manage some of that stuff sort of broadly across all of the institutional tools, not just your digital education tools. So that's something where additionally I mentioned, Edge supports members in the cybersecurity space, in the privacy and cybersecurity sort of compliance area. And that's a big thing that we look at, frankly, is the institutional policy around how data is handled wherever it might be, whether that's in a digital learning tool or a finance or HR tool or whatever the case might be there. So our cybersecurity teams are always looking at that stuff in partnership with institutions, helping to write procurement policies, helping to write institutional policies on the handling of data. So all of that is really part of the mix. So a good question, certainly highlighting, and I think is a great place to wrap up, how much this stuff really crosses boundaries, really across the institution, not just with instructional designers, not just with people supporting digital education, but all across the board. So that, really, really important question there. And to wrap up, finally, if you have any immediate needs or want to schedule a follow-up conversation on your institution's specific questions, needs, guidance around accessibility and compliance here, Michelle and Aaron on our team are excellent resources to get you connected with the various folks that might be able to help, from cybersecurity to Laura's side of the house. So we really encourage you to reach out to Michelle and or Aaron if you need any additional resources. Laura will be available for follow-up conversations, so feel free to reach out on some of the notes that I've been sending out in advance of the webinar or in reply to when we share the recording, which we will also do, by the way, or just reach out to Michelle and Aaron and they can get you connected, scheduled, and we can dive deeper on your specific challenges and needs with Laura. So thank you so much to those of you who stuck with us all the way through the session. We added another 50% onto the length with all the great questions that we got. But like I said earlier, that's why we're here. We really want to answer those questions, engage with the community, and provide all the support that we can to meet some of these essential challenges like accessibility and digital education. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Romeo. Thank you for your time today. Anything you want to leave us with as we depart?
Yeah, I mean, again, thank you so much for joining today and honestly for making accessibility such a priority on your campus. I don't think that you would be here if it weren't. And I think that, as a close, these efforts and what you are doing, where you are moving into really just make a huge difference for your students. And that's what's the most important thing, um, inclusion and success. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.